Okay, let's take a look at Blood Royale. My history with this one. I've played it once in my life. Not this copy. Played it long ago. I think, if I recall correctly, and this is really fuzzy, I think it was with a regular member of my gaming group who actually was doing videos of his own and probably still is under Dice Tower, Jason Levine. I think he owned it. And it was kind of weird, the games he owned. It meant that, like, he'd get excited, maybe bring something like this that was kind of not his normal taste. Like, it wasn't the type of game that he was generally excited about, and if somebody else brought something kind of similar, he'd be like, I don't know. And I may be mistaken, though, because I vaguely remember playing it at someone else's house, in which case maybe it was just someone really random who had it, who wasn't even our group. But basically, Jason's games tended to get played once, and then he would never bring them up again. And he would usually walk away saying, I hate this game forever. But it's not like he would want to part with it or anything like that. So it was kind of a weird situation. But whoever it was, I get the feeling that they were not tremendously thrilled with it. And it just didn't, it didn't get suggested again. Maybe it either left their hands or whatever. For me, however, I was very intrigued. I saw there were optional rules that handled some of the stuff that's missing from the game. The game is very clearly flawed from a historical standpoint, in the sense that it does not represent, it supposedly starts in 1300. It does not represent any historical position that actually existed at that time. You might be able to make an argument, no. I'm just trying to think of any time period that it represents. It does not. But the main problem there is, for 1300, if that's where it's supposed to be, Italy and Spain are major powers who theoretically control their entire area. Now, Italy didn't exist as a country. It existed as a collection of states of various power, kind of under the Holy Roman Empire for large parts of for this period, which would be Germany. Germany itself didn't exist as the same kind of state by this point as France or England or the nascent Spain did. Spain was mostly Muslim at this point. The Reconquista has not happened yet. And so it doesn't really exist as one. So it's kind of a, geez, where are we? And then the game actually makes, in the rules, they make this statement about, well, there shouldn't be any naval battles in the game because, and it gives two arguments. One is, we don't want to make this too much of a war game. And I don't really see how it makes it more of a war game, than it is. And it very blatantly states, we are not a war game. The arguments for why it's not a war game would say that Empires of the Middle Ages isn't a war game, Europa Universalis isn't a war game, at least the ones that I can tell, which is that maybe even Empires in Arms isn't. Mainly that, war isn't your best way to succeed in this. And that's fair enough, and I kind of agree with that, the Pax Britannica argument that, it's a game that contains a war game, and I think that's the case. And it contains a fairly simple war game, and there's enough detail on the land combat that there could clearly be naval combat. Their other argument, the much more dubious one, is that naval combat never happened in the medieval period. And I mean, you can immediately think in your head and say, well, wait, what about sleighs? Sleighs is kind of a special case. But it's just a false claim. First of all, the game includes the Mediterranean, and there was significant naval combat within the Mediterranean in this period. And there were a small number of significant naval combats that occurred in the Atlantic as well. Well, in the Atlantic, North Sea, Bay of Biscay for the most part, and in the Baltic as well. Um, the abstraction that they handle for naval situations is basically naval blocking, which may work well enough. But the truth of the matter was there were sieges, etc., where there were naval blockades that were attacked, and things along those lines. So I don't really know where they're coming from. But even from an Anglo-centric point of view, there were a couple. I'm trying to remember, obviously Sluys, but again, that's kind of a weird case. That's close to the coast, many of them were, and was almost a land battle fought aboard ships. But I think Bordeaux had a naval battle that was English being involved, and I think there was one in the Spanish campaigns that the English were involved in. I mean, it's just very difficult to do anything, to discuss anything and say there was no naval combat. Oh, so anyway. We're going to make the intro part before we hit the rolls kind of long on this because there's interesting reasons why I wanted this game. Given that, it's a highly abstract game that focuses, it gives you sort of I don't know, like a Borderlands type feel in some ways, except you're not, expanding your territory in the same sort of way, probably. In terms of moving resources around and stuff like that and conducting trades with people, with the thing that's missing from most other games, which is a royal marriage handling, a dynastic representation in the game. Other games tend to really do weird things to handle dynastics. So they'll have like an event that gives somebody a claim to your territory. They'll handle something like Empires of the Middle Ages does, where it's really abstracted in terms of the claims owned by territories. If you conquer someone's territory, they still have claim to it and can inherit it through cards, stuff like that. In something like Europa Universalis from a different later period, you had the dynastics handled within within the triggering of historical events. So your gameplay didn't really impact your dynastics for the most part. No, there were some differences. A royal marriage could cause something to happen, but it basically just gives you a casus belli. Casus bellum. This covers the broad scale, politics supposedly, which are underpinned by that dynastic situation of the medieval period, which is incredibly interesting to me. There was one other game which handles a similar situation, and it is even more flawed, and is really only a little booklet, basically, and a map or whatever. It's one of these tiny little cheap publishing. If you saw my Fall of Rome, well, more likely the shit. Now I'm having trouble even remembering what it was called. Anyway, it was one I really wanted, and I have now. Anyway, Popes and Princes was this little tiny booklet, a little map, I think, that, had way too many tiny little provinces in it, if I recall correctly. And it was basically a set of notes on what maybe some game might be. This at least is a playable game, as is, if I recall correctly. Although one that, shows its limitations very quickly. That one was more an aspirational, hey, I wish I could make this game. And one of the people involved in it eventually made a computerized play-by-email type thing where he ran something similar to Popes and Princes on that probably worked out some more rules, but it definitely had a lot of human intervention. There was a game master to it, which, you know, to some extent, yeah, you could do anything with a game master, you know, as long as somebody's coming up with the rules. So this was one of a number of games that I had looked at, maybe played a little bit of, and tried to think, and they influenced a design of my own that's nascent and never got completed because it ended up too complex. And what it ended up similar to was something like Crusader Kings, the computer game, which obviously you can't do that on a board game. I mean, that's the sort of line that my thoughts were going into, where every single character had a relationship with every other character on the board. At least a potential one, you know, a potential value of a relationship for that. Well, you're going to end up needing spreadsheets or a relational database to start handling that kind of stuff. And obviously, you know, once you start doing computer assisted, why not just go to a computer game? Why not play Crusader Kings? Well, I don't know. One of the reasons is I would really like to represent something better on a board position. And one of my thoughts is, since I'm doing something stupid, let me bring it in. Hold on, since it actually is relevant. This sucker up because the intention of my game was always eventually to be historically, let's leave it out here for a moment, historically set in the Holy Rolling Empire. The idea being that you had these different layers of political positioning within it. The problem is medieval era and later into the early modern history was never static. You know, the formations of the things that governed a country were really not something that you could codify in a set of rules. And if you tried to, you'd get into a lot of details on that kind of stuff. And you'll see this in Crusader Kings, for example, where the different inheritance laws change throughout the different provinces, and they're different in each province. Well, more than that, the actual territories that make up, you know, a province were not fixed at any point. So, you know, you had divisions of territories. You had no sort of atomic level that you could actually say, this is what I want to represent. Which means, if you want to represent anything with the fluidity that the actual situation had, Crusader Kings doesn't go far enough, right? You'd have to break each of the provinces there into so many little pieces so that you could trade away towns and castles and all kind of stuff like that. Property changed hands a lot more quickly than maybe you kind of think, right? And the problem is that I keep grasping for something that doesn't exist. And it's the kind of abstraction that game designers are capable of doing, and that I am always like, oh, I can't make that sacrifice. I can't make that compromise. But I'm always reaching for it. If you look at something like, and I try to think of ways to do so, but if you look at something along the lines of Empires of the Middle Ages, it abstracts things so much that these problems kind of don't really come into play. Is I guess my position on that. The thing is, you know, you have something like Hesse, which is a fairly, you know, at one point was a fairly significant piece of unitary territory, but it's split up into several different pieces, and you've got a lot of that going on. And then you've got the transfer of things from imperial, you know, provinces to sort of, you know, ones that directly related to the empire to ones that, you know, owed allegiance to a prince, but they transferred back and forth and moved around. And in a lot of ways, it was just kind of up to the emperor to say, yeah, I'm willing to do this. And the way that he got the agreement to do it was through essentially basically just negotiations, which is one of the kind of nice things here is that it's largely a negotiations game. Anyhow, whenever I start looking at something and trying to create a model for it, this is my problem. I'm just unwilling to let that model go, or let that model actually constrain the reality and limit it where there are going to be the obvious flaws that a model has. So what do we have in this game? First of all, we have a limited map of Western Europe that doesn't look very good. I mean, it's kind of... So this is one of the things, it's why I feel almost like I have to make things for a fantasy universe, because it doesn't really work in a real universe, right? But that's what you kind of have here, is this almost a fantasy representation of Western Europe. And it clearly is if it's 1300 and you've got Spain and Italy as royal powers on the same level. And then, of course, oh well, we'll get into more things here, but like, you can't marry down. You can't just pick up a wife from somewhere. No, EU, actually, somebody wrote up a set of rules that kind of tried to take the dynastic sequence from this and add it to EU. And it was, of course, more complicated than the one from this. But I don't know. All right. So what do we have for components? Well, we got these little army counters, which is your force pool size. That's all you can have per country. You have control markers, not a whole lot of them. You're not expected to be changing the borders much. A few fleets. A capital, which is in case you lose your main capital in the base game, it moves. There are some options that allow you to shift the capitals and resource markers around. Over here, what should we got? We have monies. I may not be able to cope with this money. It's little coins that, have numbers on them that are basically indistinguishable from each other, except by the number on them, and the number's not very clearly written. This back in an old day where it wasn't easy to like print in color on the counters or something, and you'll see one of the answers to that. These are, I haven't pulled these out yet, unfortunately. These are tokens that represent, I wonder what those little things are. These are tokens that represent various personalities in the game. Basically, you have a king and up to 5 princes, and these personalities can lead your armies using, well, we'll see, using their own stats. You have resource counters. Resources are one of the key issues to the game. Notice that it says power is wealth, wealth is power. That's the theory of the game. In essence, you're trying to make money in this game. It's kind of like Lords of the Sierra Madre or Lords of the Renaissance, in the sense that, like, it all devolves down to cash, which makes no sense to me, right? And we may, I don't know. I honestly don't know what I'm going to do in terms of play of this. We'll go through that as I go through the rules, kind of like, because my purpose to this is not necessarily to show this as a game. I don't think it's a fantastic game as a game. There's a reason it didn't get republished. But I also think it contains some really interesting ideas and is a nice framework for exploring the dynastic and other aspects. These are for optional rules. Their rebellions and famine will hit them. They show up in the provinces. Neutral armies, again, something that comes up in the optional rules. And then neutral provinces, I think that's what they say. Yeah. Fuck. Okay. And some of the provinces will start out neutral in the optional rules, which, you immediately start thinking, well, you could then represent the Reconquista. Let's just pronounce that in a way that, I think it's technically okay, but it clashes with my sensibilities horribly. by making a lot of Spain neutral. Of course, you actually have two kingdoms in Spain that are, well, two major ones in the end. And you also have Portugal. So there's a lot of little kingdoms. We'll play Hispania sometime and you can see that develop. All of Italy could be, I don't know. I mean, if you throw it all to neutral, 1300, I'm trying to remember my history, because this is one of the problems with that history of the Holy Roman Empire. There's nothing that really gives you just a really good picture of, what was happening across periods. What I find is, even with this book, they tend to be disjointed. And I picked this one up because I thought it would be more popularized and able to give me a better grasp of what was going on. Because most of the, more, I don't know, I say more scholarly. Most of the stuff I looked for previous to this was like, things that were not intended for a popular audience at all, that were not intended to be sold generally, that were only intended as either textbooks for classes or they were somebody's research work that was bound or whatever. So they didn't give me much help, but this isn't either. Basically, the choices are going into way too little detail and just glossing over everything, or so much detail in so many different things with focus divided up all over that I don't have a picture that I can sort of tie together. And this does not really help much in terms of that. I was hoping it would, but actually I knew it wouldn't. Because optimist that I am, I'm also a realist in the sense that I know that nothing ever works out the way you want it to. But I thought it might spark some of my ideas. It did a little bit, and then what the hell, I've been working my way through it for a year. I'm about halfway through, and I keep reading other things in between or whatever, and it's actually delaying my reading, which is why I have a pile of books over here. Because there's little libraries all over the place, and I find anything interesting and I put it there, and my reading is not keeping up with what I've been pulling. Plus I pulled up stuff that I had in Phoenix as well. I gotta swap batteries. Boy, this is gonna take a long time to go through the intro if I keep up at this level, and the rules are not the easiest to deal with. I'll get my battery swapped and then keep chattering. What I can say about my reading is, yes, like my gaming, it's slowed down tremendously. And honestly, I blame the computer more on that than anything else, although work definitely affects it. Like, between reading and gaming, those were my two major activities for a long period of my life. And yes, work cuts into that a significant amount, but the computer, I think, does more damage in terms of being able to find time to do stuff. Okay, let's keep looking at components here. You get a little, hey, here's most of what you need to play the game. A little rule summary. I haven't even looked it over, mainly because it can't be any worse than the rule book, though. We'll talk about the rule book. Oh, okay, whatever. It's glossy. Hey, what's up with that? This isn't an odd period for a full glossy rule book. I have the feeling that glossy paper was more expensive at this time in most places, but that may not have been the case in the UK. It may have been that because of the lower quantity of wood and such not, that a more chemically produced paper was more effective. It is Games Workshop, so it's vague, it's missing pieces, it leaves inconsistencies, it leaves you scratching your head. It's not well written, but it's not as bad as Talisman, at least. Boy, am I glad Warrior Knights got a remake, right? That was just so much better than the original. And gives you rules that allow you to play it that's kind of close to the original in terms of sense. Set of event cards. I have not even looked at these. These are not at all glossy. These are old style, hey, these came in a sheet and had to be torn apart cards, again, of the time period. That they're an optional rule, and I am going to use them. I'm going to use some of the optional rules, maybe not all of them. You have that money there. You also have these monies, bigger bills. I may end up just going to poker chips for everything for the money because again, those are indiscernible and I don't know how much. I mean, bearer bond, come on, what the fuck? Paper money? You got little pads of paper. What's up with these? This is to write down marriage contracts. I'm gonna definitely use normal sheets of paper for that. This is to represent individual characters, and you can draw their shield in. Great. If you're an artist and want to draw the shields of the different countries in. You put information down that's necessary to explain them. I'm not even sure what this is. This may be just their survival roles, whether they've created children or whatever. I don't even remember what this stuff is for. But it's important to know their age of birth because that impacts... Well, one thing that you get is this is your survival role in this column. And the older you get, the harder it is to survive. So... there is that. But yeah, I'm not absolutely certain what is put in these, maybe some other notations. And that's what all the rest of the pads are. And again, I'll probably use paper for those, mainly because a whole bunch of little sheets. I mean, remember, you could have maybe a dozen sheets for a given player in play, very easily. Because you have sheets for... them, for the king, for the 5 princes, and for all the wives. And the children. And it's not just the 5 princes. You can end up with really big dynastic families in this, which is something that I'm going to keep in mind. So I don't know how long I'm going to play for. This runs you 100 years. 100 years doesn't feel like a very long time for a game about the dynasties, right? But the game may bloat too much in terms of number of characters in the game if you run further than that. And I don't know what else it's going to do. So I'm kind of targeting that, but may extend it or may cut it short or whatever. So that's the components. Let's get to the rolls. And there's nothing on the board at the beginning of the game. All your armies and stuff have to be built. All right, let me take a little pause. This is a game that the core of it, you know, in terms of like the things you'd expect in a game that wasn't dealing with the dynasties, whatever, is actually pretty simple. And of course, being Games Workshop, they go through a lot of pain to describe it. The character and relationships, well, not so much relations, but the character rules add a little bit to it. It still ends up weighing in at 24 pages. Might not be too bad. So the base sequence of the game is placed here, where you do some dynastic stuff, figuring out, you know, how the family works. And the larger the number of characters in the game that are married, well, the larger the number of characters, the more die rolls you're going to have to make. A whole bunch. Survival rolls, birth rolls, etc. And then new characters have to be rolled up, and they roll on this little chart. And there are not modifiers to that, if I recall correctly. Your initial characters, your king and your queen, are supposed to be all neutral. And there are arguments for this, and there's an optional rule to make it so that you roll them up like you do anything else. The main argument they give for why you shouldn't, you know, roll up a character is you might get a lousy constitution and your character dies right away, and that would be a horrible disadvantage. But your character might die anyway right away, and that would be a horrible disadvantage. And they kind of make this suggestion of, well, you should make it so that there's no death rolls, within the first few turns if you're playing with this option. I would say if you're worried about that outcome, you should make there be no death rolls. There is a chance of any character dying, and that -2 constitution definitely increases that chance tremendously, but that's not all that likely, and you might well die before you have kids and whatnot. Okay, let me keep looking here. Then you go through a sort of economic interface where you grab your taxes, you get little resource markers from over there, and they get placed in the places that produce them automatically. You take care of the famines and rebellions, and you pay for any forces you have on the board, and then you pay to raise new forces. And raising new forces is kind of weird in this game. It's basically one player can say, well, I'm going to build some armies. And then kind of like a Pax Britannica type situation, everyone gets to react to that. So basically, until everyone's decided they're done, you're still going, which works a little better than Pax Britannica, because in Pax Britannica there are definite reasons not to commit to doing something. Here, it's it's very easy to say I'm done if nobody else is doing anything. That's a much harder decision in Pax Britannica, because it's not just about armies, it's about where you're intervening, and somebody could be holding off on something that they want to play in order to force a conflict. Okay. Then you go to a sequence of movement events. Now, one of the optional rules adds a third movement event in the course of a turn. Now, my understanding is each turn is 5 years, and, you have 2 or 3 campaigning seasons in that whole time. Which may not be unreasonable, to tell you the truth. But there certainly were times when campaigning seasons happened more like once a year, or even more than that. And you would have a chance to build up armies in between as well. So that's a little weird. But basically what happens there is one player will be... You have a randomization as to who goes first, and you just pull these out. So it's completely random who goes in any particular point, except that if you've gone already in that movement phase, you aren't going to go again. And whoever drew first gets an event. And there's 2 ways to handle the events. One is a die roll. The other is this richer event deck, which I want to use. I can't make any guarantees that they're going to be easy to apply. Okay. All right, now we jump into a full game turn, which only covers really part of the Dynastic sequence. Great rules organization there, but anyway, I'm just going to skim kind of going through this. This actually does go through... No, this does go through the full game turn. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And it spells out what actually happens, and I kind of went through this. So for birth, each married couple who... the female is 50 years old or younger, and both characters are free from imprisonment and such not, are allowed to roll a die to see if they have a kid. If they get a 7 or more, they have a child. Now, you're allowed to try to spawn twice more, but each one will reduce your wife's chance of survival. These are to represent surviving kids. These will survive until age 15, which means you won't have to make any survival checks on them, What it does give you is foreknowledge of which kids are going to survive and which aren't, which is a little unfair and unreasonable, but whatever. When you bring a character into play, you roll dice to see what their stats are going to be. And they have 3 stats, I believe. Just take a look here. Constitution, which is going to affect their survival rate. Charisma. Charisma does a number of things. It affects revolt chances for the ruler. It affects capability of that. We'll get into it. It affects dowries essentially, but in a weird sort of way. And strength and guile. Strength is going to affect, is for the male characters only. It's going to affect how good they are in battle and combat situations. Guile, their wife just makes them better in combat through this. Again, combat may represent a bunch of abstractions there. It may indicate, capabilities of getting alliance forces and stuff that are not directly represented in the game, which are abstracted by that modifier in combat, maybe local forces, whatever you want to say. Sex is random. You fill out things like the dynasty. It's important to keep track of which dynasty the character belongs to. Well, was spawned from. It may end up belonging to a different one at some point or another. And who their parents are. You're not, well, we'll get to the marriage rules. Once a male reaches age 20, not 15, which is weird because there were definitely soldiers at a younger age who at least were figurehead rulers, and you certainly have, by 17 or so, you're starting to see most princes, you're beginning to see leaders at that age showing up leading forces. But they may be the exception rather than the rule, so whatever. You can have up to 5 royal princes on the board, like I said, and you put them as they occur, which means you might get someone who's really great at military capabilities, but you have 5 princes on the board, well, you're screwed. You will not get to put him on the board until someone loses their piece, which is probably through death. Then you check for survival, and this is a roll against their current age. You have your survival targets there, so, at age 15, you only need a 3 or more on 2 dice, I think. I'm not sure. 2 dice, yeah. The game comes with 3 6-siders and a 10-sider. So some of the things like this use 3 dice, some use 2. We had to use a D&D style 3 dice for your stats. I wonder if the modifiers actually align to the D&D modifiers. They're close. I wouldn't be shocked if that's what drove it. If the character dies, you rip up their character sheet or cross through it. Yeah. If a married character is with their spouse, they become released and go back to their original dynasty once their spouse dies, unless they're a queen mother, in which case they're not allowed to go around and remarry and stuff. Tell Eleanor. She straight out just got divorced, and there's no rules for that. At age 15, you're allowed to marry characters. You're not allowed to marry them before that. No papal dispensations or anything like that for that. And the female will generally join the male's dynasty unless you write something separate into the contract. You can arrange marriages earlier than this. You can even write them into marriage contracts, in which case they're binding, but you cannot actually consummate the marriage, and it has no effect on play and doesn't actually exist until then. Okay. Two characters with the same dynastic name are not allowed to marry. However, you could well have someone end up marrying their own children or grandchildren. And the game actually specifically, spells out, ain't too bad. For the sake of ickiness, I'd rather try to avoid that. I may keep track of a family tree and try to avoid ridiculously marriages that the Pope just would not accept no matter what. You're basically able to, when you create a marriage, you must write yourself a marriage contract. And any special circumstances involved in it, you write down, which might be things that affect the marriage itself. For example, this person takes on, will stay with this dynasty. That's often the case. Let's say you have a female heir to the throne. Well, if you don't write anything into it, that female heir could well inherit the throne and end up creating something like, Habsburgs owning Spain and Austria. We're not going to go into the Bourbon one because that was actually inflicted through a peace treaty as well. Uh-oh, I got to check my battery. It looks like it's not charging. It doesn't sit perfectly. See? Going on and off now. Yeah, it's not good. Anyway. So what does your bride bring you? You can also write things down like non-aggression treaties, treaties of aggression, trade agreements, all kind of stuff like that into a marriage contract. Basically anything that the rules don't disallow, and they are all binding. You cannot violate a marriage contract. That is ahistorical. But again, it was the norm to try to follow them. Okay. Let's look at this. Effective characteristics. So brides give their military strength equal to their guile rating to their husband. However, this can't bring the husband outside the range of -2 to +2. There are things that do allow stats to go outside that range, and they're specified. Brides with a positive charisma score bring a cash benefit to their husband, and those with a minus rating bring a cash penalty. This is not meant to represent the dowry itself. I know I kind of said that. Any dowry, any transfer of cash, and you could call it a dowry, you can call it a bride price because they go both ways, is just written into the into the marriage contract. So a bride with a +1 score gives 30 crowns to the male. A bride with a +2 charisma gives 60. And the reverse for negatives. These are meant to represent kind of how well the bride is received. Now, how that works with male characters, I don't know if it's spelled out. So if a male is going over to a dynasty, they may end up a ruler, they may not, and it's all twisted there. If a bride marries a king or prince who later becomes a king, a king or a prince who later becomes a king, the player from whose dynasty she came gets 100 crowns because of the added worth, whatever, the added prestige seen there. Okay. What about succession? Well, first of all, the players can agree that the husband joins the female character's dynasty, and then the husband's character is given to the female character, and they can fight as a prince of her country, and any children of the marriage no matter whose dynastic name they actually carry. It's kind of a weird situation, but technically they should carry his. Will be treated just as if they were the children of the male character. This can lead where a prince does battle against his father. Yeah, history has many examples of this, but not usually fighting for their father-in-law. So that tends to be a much odder case. Usually the prince is fighting their father to grab control of the kingdom. Should a married female character ascend the throne, her husband will become consort, and if not already the case, the player controlling the queen's original dynasty will take control of the queen, her consort, and any children in marriage. There is no rule here that says queens can't become, you can't become queen of a country. Now, many of these countries could not have a queen. The Empire definitely couldn't have a queen. France couldn't have a ruling queen. England, the issue was in doubt. Let's put it that way. There was historical precedent for it, so it would be one of the few places where you could have that. Italy didn't exist. Spain, I think it depended on whether it was Castile or Aragon. I think they had different inheritance rules that were significant. So again, we've simplified things and abstracted them and put sort of a single law across the world, which just did not exist. And Crusader Kings shows that nicely. If you want to violate those laws, you have to do special things. Here, they make a single law for the game. Should a married female character? Yeah, okay. Now, the only benefit to the male character's original power is they will get the benefit for a marriage to a monarch. I don't know if males turn into brides for this. That's not specified. And their charisma is not necessarily useful. We'll see when we look at the governorship rules how that works out. Okay, it is possible that nobody will give you a marriage under conditions that you want, and you may end up losing your kingdom. And somebody may end up ruling two kingdoms. On the other hand, you can just let your dynasty die out, and then you get to start a new one in that same country. So, honestly, I'm a little disturbed because there is absolutely no... there's no impetus to force someone to try to find a marriage and to keep their dynasty alive. Which is to say things like the Kingdom of Bohemia. And there were a number of cases where you had female heirs to important territories who, there was not some, well, you'll join our kingdom instead. Honestly, I would say the norm was to consolidate, where, the laws went in that direction. So again, the game fails in that aspect. The children of a marriage are always brought up by the male character's dynasty, except when the marriage contract says otherwise, or cases where the wife is the queen of the original country. Again, you can spell out whatever you want in the marriage contract, pretty much so. Succession, it follows male primogeniture, following sort of whatever the English tradition is. I don't remember the words for it. What's Salian? What's, the eldest son down through his family, boys and then girls, the second son down through their family, etc. If no successor can be traced, the king is assumed to have a relative who can be created and played by that dynasty's player. The relative is 5 years younger than the deceased king, is married to a wife 5 years younger than himself, and has a child for every 5 years of their marriage. So it's even much better than your starting position. You have a bunch of kids. The player should create character record sheets for the new royal family. I really don't like these rules, this part. When a prince ascends the throne, the controlling player should at once exchange the king for the princes, and then he's got an available extra prince player. If a female ascends to the throne, the rules of succession become slightly more complicated. The king piece is removed from the board, since the queen may never leave her capital. Her charisma ratings are used for the rebellions, and she performs the other functions of a king, though she cannot be moved from the capital or lead armies. In addition, if the queen is married and controlled by another player, when she inherits the throne, she is returned to her original dynasty at once. So if you inherit the crown, well, this is weird. She brings any unmarried children from the marriage and her husband, who is then prince consort. His prince piece is swapped for one of the queen's countries. So this sounds like the queen, having a female heir is not really a threat, whereas here it sounded differently. If a married queen, I would say that is the exceptional situation, but let's keep going, because we get to the one point where you could end up with a dual crown. If a married queen dies, her consort is returned to his original dynasty in the same way as most female characters return to their original dynasty. The children of the marriage stay with the queen. The exception to all of this is when the queen is married to a king, or to a character who becomes a king of another country. In this case, the control of the king, queen, and all children remains or reverts to the male character's player. In that case, too, a dynastic union would have taken place. So there's not much harm to marrying a male. Like, if you have a queen who's an heir, as long as you don't marry someone who is likely to assume the throne, it's probably pretty safe. And if you are marrying someone who's not that likely to assume the throne, well, getting that contract might not be that expensive, that says he cannot, he's excluded from the succession. Honestly, the idea of a dynastic union is fairly rare among countries this large. The one case you have is the Austrians and Spanish Habsburgs, which lasts for a grand total of one king and is then divided up. Yeah, one, I think. You have similar unions between Denmark and Sweden, and you have cases with important rulers who take over the Polish throne. But that's weird because that's an elected throne, and Poland is kind of not really in the game. I believe it counts as this space, and Denmark also, and Wales. These can be added to the game optionally. Okay, but are not very important, which is unreasonable, but, well, honestly, Poland was still such a mess that being king of Poland wouldn't have granted you too much. But it was worth something. Okay. All right, I think we pause for a little bit before we go to disputed successions. You're allowed to say, hey, I don't want the legitimate heir to take the throne in my country. In one case, it's if the heir is a prisoner in another country. And this is kind of a weird thing because, yes, you wouldn't be able to crown that person, but normally you also wouldn't have an easy time skipping them over. And the other is if the heir is a female character controlled by another player as a result of marriage. I.e., even if you made a bad marriage, you can say, screw it, I won't. But there are penalties for this. If the heir is a prisoner and you don't pass over that character, the player will be running an increased risk of rebellion because the king will never be in the capital. And we'll see that in a bit. Players are more likely to pass over a female character for succession when they're married to a foreign king or a foreign prince, because that may inherit the throne, because then you lose your dynasty and you become a baronial dynasty, which is a problematic situation. Normally, a female character who comes to the throne, though, will come back with their consort and any children unless the consort becomes a king. In this case, there would be a dynastic union, and that would ruin your dynasty. You would no longer control your country, even though you'd still control the family. If you have a female character who's likely to ascend to the throne, you can attempt to insist on a clause in personal contracts where the husband renounces the claim. And we've already talked about that. Now, if you pass over a legitimate heir, because there's a female character married into another dynasty, all male characters in that dynasty will have a -1 to their strength score, which can go below a -2, for as long as the legitimate heir to the throne or heirs is still alive. And this is representing, the difficulty in getting loyal troops and whatnot more than anything else, not well, they become a worse military leader because a dynasty controlling the rightful heir gets a +1 bonus to their strength for all their characters whenever they're fighting the usurper. And this can also, I think, take you above +2, but I'm not sure. It doesn't specify there. One way or the other. Usually it says one way or the other. A player controlling a passed-over character must agree to renounce the claim of a passed-over character or her heirs as part of a marriage contract with the usurper dynasty. I'm not sure what that means. You can't marry them into their dynasty unless you renounce your claim. Clearly, that was not always the case. There were cases where claims were sustained beyond. Alternatively, it is possible for there to be a rival claimant to the throne for the rest of the game, making the player's task permanently. This might be simply the way they write the rules, and they're saying, well, you must do this if you're going to clear that up, but they don't specify that. It would be as well to arrange for a marriage contract by which the rival renounces the claim as soon as possible. This dropping of the claim would even last after the end of the marriage contract. There's a lot of editorializing in the rules. This is standard for Games Workshop, as if it gives more explanation, but whatever. If you choose to pass over the rightful male heir who's being held prisoner, all your characters fight with a -1 strength penalty as outlined above. Additionally, the monarch receives a penalty to their charisma score, representing factions that will cause problems once given a cause. The player should roll a die on a 1 through 3. The new monarch's charisma is reduced by 1, and a 4 through 6 it's reduced by 2. This can take them down to a -3 or -4. This penalty can't be inherited by any of their new heirs, but it can reduce the current monarch's charisma below -2. Controlling 2 countries. If you happen to control 2 countries through a dynastic union, for example, you have obvious advantages and some disadvantages. The player controlling the annexed country has complete control over it and can tax, raise trade items, raise troops. Existing army and fleet counters on the map remain in play. Controlled by the new player, the player order marker for the controlled country should be placed to the side, and the 2 countries are basically a joint country. However, unrest will cause a -2 modifier on the monarch's charisma when rolling on the rebellion table in home provinces of the annexed country. This can reduce a character's charisma below -2. This continues for as long as the country is ruled by a foreign monarch. Also, the foreign monarch is only allowed to raise 1 army per controlled province and not 2. I don't remember the raising armies rules having that limitation, but okay. Since rebellion can be costly and might even spread into the player's own country, and since the annexed country might be more difficult to defend, a player in this position can abandon their rights to it and allow a new monarch to be established by the landless player. The player must return all home provinces, but not captured ones necessarily, unless a marriage contract can be arranged, which ceded certain provinces to his or her control. If a player lost control of a country because his or her dynasty died out, that player should be allowed to establish a new dynasty following the no heir. If, on the other hand, the player remains landless for any length of time, he or she is in real difficulties, though the player may have hopes of regaining the throne through normal rules of succession. They will control the dynasty's money and any prince counters on the map. They would still be part of the dynastic sequence, but would only raise taxes or trade items with the express permission of another player, who would forfeit the income from his or her own tax and trade revenues. We'll see. The optional rules add some other possibilities here, but we'll see. The aim of such a player would be to get one of their children in an advantageous marriage and inherit a throne. But remember, the throne they inherit may well be a dual throne or something. So there's all kind of weird shit going on there. If a minor ascends to the throne, a regency is established. The player can bring in any other character to act as a regent. If none is available, a baron or cousin of the late king is created. He's 5 years younger than the late king, and characteristic die rolls are made for them. I don't know if they get a sheet. If an existing character is made regent, he or she merely assumes the role of king and all its vested powers until the true king reaches 15. At that time, the character reverts to a normal role. If the character was created, he's retired from the game at this side. He cannot have a wife, does not marry, and produces no children, as far as the game is concerned. Yeah, so this is just a noble within the kingdom who becomes regent. End of the dynastic sequence. At the end of the dynastic sequence, players must announce everything that happened in their house. They give a verbal report of all the information. New characteristic scores are announced. They're always available. Whew. Then we hit the interphase, which is, again, the economic series in this. During the taxation phase, each player gets 5 crowns for each province he controls. But they can increase that to a 7 crown tax. That'll give a -2 modifier when determining if a rebellion breaks out in the event segment of the movement phase. Players must tax all their provinces at either 5 or 7 crown rate. They can't choose differently. The players, there may be modifiers to that. The players should record their taxation levels on scrap paper and reveal them simultaneously. Then resource items are placed on all the spaces that indicate them. Oh, and I didn't go over the different resources. So there's 4 basic resources in the game, which are, 3 basic resources, which are metal, food, and sheep. Cloth. There's semi-luxuries, and then there's full luxuries as well. We'll go over the rules, but in a very basic sense, you need to get a set of 3 basic resources to get any value at all. And then if you enhance them with semi-luxuries with semi-luxuries, or with semi-luxuries and with luxuries, you get you can trade them in for more monies. Remember the game, power is wealth, wealth is power. The game is about who has the most money at the end. And I could see, trying to leverage this system onto the very much more complicated ruling of the trade powers in a game like Lords of the Renaissance. It's almost like Lords of the Renaissance took one factor of this commodities thing and said, well, that's interesting. Let me try to figure this out. Phil Eklund has already, I think Lords of the Sierra Madre already had a richer, was prior to it and had a richer system. But I could almost see that similarity. Hey, let's try to develop a richer trade system, because it is not the Lords of the Sierra Madre trade system. But it's related. It's somewhere between these two, kind of. It's more like Lords of the Sierra Madre. So I'm not going to... but I wouldn't be surprised if, ideas boil in from something this old coming over there. And likewise, I could see something like this working into that Empires of the Middle Ages type game, where you want to represent, the marriage contracts and everything in specific ways. Unlike Empires of the Middle Ages, which had very explicit rules that handle every more or less case that comes up in the game, in this one, things are left a lot looser, as is Game Workshop's tendency, which, could you fold them in? Could you make something like this ironclad enough? I don't know, probably not, because you want those marriage contracts to be very loose. And that means that those very explicit rules in Empires of the Middle Ages or in Lords of the Renaissance become harder to fit in, but you could probably still work them in. And I could see some sort of grand, consolidation of the 3 games. Take the dynastic sequence from this, take the kind of rulership sequence from Empires of the Middle Ages more, which I don't know. This could definitely fit into either. I don't know if you could actually consolidate all three very well. But one of the problems is, in all of these situations, there's a whole lot more players in the game than are represented in any of the games. Even in Empires in the Middle Ages, you could make arguments for lots of little players needing to be there. And the same thing's true with Popes and Princes. You know, it worked out with a couple hundred people playing on the play by email. All right, so where are we? Let's talk about the resources. Certain provinces are resource areas. They're marked on the board. During places resources, you get a counter in each area which is not affected by famine. So there'll be 9 basic, 2 semi-luxury, and 1 luxury on the board. Big deal here. So the semi-luxuries are down here, and the luxury is here. So everything is to the south if you want to increase your valuation. No country has a trade set on its own either. That's important. That in fact is a vital precondition on the game. So you've got to force people to either trade or take military action. And even in the optional rules where you can scramble up the trade locations, that is still a precondition to the game. Resources counters are placed on the game even if the resource area still contains previously placed counters. Only the famine stops production. Then you maintain and raise armies and fleets. You have to pay 2 crowns per each army and fleet you have on the map. If you can't maintain, you remove them from the map at no real penalty. Some games in this time period and a little later worry about like marauders and stuff like that, and basically the cost of decommissioning troops is higher than the cost of maintaining them, one way or the other. This does not have that. Each player may increase the size of their forces by paying 5 crowns for each additional army and fleet they want on the map. You have a maximum of 20 armies and 4 fleets. I hope I have all the counters. It's a used game, you know. I don't have any idea. Plus, I've never played this version, this copy. New armies are placed in the capital and fleets in any coastal home provinces, ignoring any provinces gained at the expense of other countries. Additionally, a player may never bring additional armies onto the map that would increase the number of armies he has deployed to a figure greater than 2 times the number of home provinces. So that's the thing. So if you conquer a nation, you're allowed to add the number of home countries. Now, what did we say? There's 10? 20 armies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I guess Calais. 10. I'm curious because some of these don't. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah. Okay. So you've got a counter mix that exactly matches the size of the countries, I think. Okay. Troops raised as replacement for losses are drawn from the stock on the side of the board. You can't raise troops from the army counters that are on the year track. When things die, they go here, and they will come back to your force pool over time. Okay. Movement phase, player order. You've got a cup with 1 chip for each player. You draw to see who goes first. Whoever is drawn first will roll a die normally and handle this events table. We'll be using the events cards because they excite me more. And they have presumably some twisted stuff in them. We'll see that. So these just handle plagues, famine, rebellion, storms, and yeah. Okay. Which I think are going to be the major events in the deck, but we'll see. The first player then takes their turn moving and doing any combat, and then they draw another player order marker, and then the next player goes. There's only 1 event check at the beginning of the sequence. Then once each player has gone, the chits go back in the cup, and we go through another sequence, another event card, and 5 more players get turns. With an optional roll, you add a third sequence in there. Probably go with that because 2 seems like it's limited. The movement phase, the events, you roll a die and see what happens. So Plague is going to cause army counters must be removed and they die. A king or prince in the province makes a survival check for death with a penalty. Famine, you roll for how many provinces there are. There's a randomization table here. And then you check which provinces get a famine marker. All army units in a province with a famine have to leave the province during their next movement turn. You can't move through a province with famine, and it produces no taxation or resource during the next interphase. The marker stays there, so it could show up on the first movement phase, and it'll stay there for the rest of the 10-year, 5-year period. Sorry, 5-year period. Okay. Rebellion, you roll a die once for each province you own and modify the result by considering various penalties to your charisma. Basically, you get your charisma, you get a penalty of 1 for being away from the capital. Additional taxation gives a penalty of 2. Royal mail in the province gives a bonus of that character's charisma, which could be a penalty. If an adjacent province is in revolt, there's a penalty. Prior revolt, there's a penalty for that. The monarch's charisma can be affected by a succession, imprisonment, of course. A roll of 1 or less means a rebellion's occurred and a rebellion marker is placed. The rebellion will be put down immediately as soon as 4 army counters are in that province and remain there at the end of a movement turn. And I don't think it can be placed if there's 4 army units there, but I'm not right. I thought I remembered that. The king or prince counts as 1 army counter for this. Rebellion markers can be removed by the payment of 15 crowns per marker during the next interphase after taxes have been raised and resource items placed. A province marked with a rebellion produces no taxes nor resources during the next interphase. Army counters and trade items accompanied by army counters can move through a province affected by rebellion. Unaccompanied resources may not. If storms come up, all fleets at sea, on a roll of 1 or 2, the fleet and all of its contents are lost. This is if they're actually at sea, not on a coastal area. We'll see the rules on fleet movement. Any army counters lost are put on the year track as if they were lost in combat. Resource items go back into the pool so that they can show back up. Any royal characters drown. Okay. How are we? Let me check the battery strength. Okay, that was a little weird, and I'm hoping that like my that I have a whole video here because it just updated the management thing. My battery died and weird shit may have happened. I'm gonna have to check this. So, whoopee. Appears to be still there. So the capital at the beginning of the game has a strength of 10 army counters. It is essentially considered to be fortified territories within the heartland or whatever. There's nothing else like this in the game. You can have additional forces, and they can either be in the castle, in which case they defend the castle itself, or out in the grounds. And once the castle is being attacked, anything you bring in, is external and can be fought separately from the castle. The castle has to be defeated, destroyed, for so this is the movement of a capital. The castle itself has to be defeated or destroyed in order to capture that territory. Now, once the capital is taken, you can make another home province to be your capital, but it doesn't have a castle. The castle, once destroyed, is gone from the game forever. The capital marker is removed as soon as the player recaptures his original capital. If a new capital is captured, I would actually say you probably should keep it on the board at that point because it represents that there is no castle anymore. If the capital, but move to the old capital again. The new capital can be captured. If you lose your capital, well, if you have lost your original capital, your charisma is down by 1 until the capital is retaken. This may not take the maximum charisma score outside the plus to -2 range. And this is one of the problems. There's all these little, this one affects this one doesn't type rolls that are going to be a pain in the ass. And I don't think there's anywhere where they're summarized specifically. But combat itself. Combat takes place at the end of each player's movement phase. All pieces can take part in the battle. It's basically a buckets of dice type of system, but with some pre-combat die rolls that impact it. It's kind of a more clever than I'd expect. Okay. So let's avoid the pre-combat die rolls and tell you the basics. The basics are however many counters you have, up to 4. It's not buckets of dice, but it works similarly. However many, in terms of effect, however many combat counters you have up to 4 is the range of damage you can do. So I can roll a die, and on a 1 through 4, if I have 4 counters, I do that many hits on the enemy. However, if I have a prince available, that range goes up to 5. If I have a king available, that range goes up to 6. And I believe the leader counters actually count as military units as well. Let me check. They don't cost you anything, which is kind of weird. Yep, a king or prince counts as 1 army counter. So the most you can do is 4 damage to someone unless you have a leader with you, no matter how big your army. And there's no real reason to have a larger than 6 army except to take losses with, because there are multiple rounds of combat. Now, I told you there's this pre-die roll thing. So if a royal piece with a strength of +1 is part of an army in the province, he gets a free die roll before the battle starts, which he can cause casualties just like normal, except without any leader modifiers. So 4 is the most you can do off the die roll. If you have a +2, you get to roll 2 dice extra. So you can do a lot of damage just on leadership, basically, if you have the army to back it up as well. Basically, going into battle without a leader means you just roll a die once on here, and your maximum damage is 4. But with a +2 leader, you could do, let's say it's your king, 6 + 8, 14 points of damage on someone. Now, remember, the maximum army in a country has is 20. Okay. The royal piece doesn't count as an extra army. It doesn't alter the casualties. If there's more than 1 royal piece on the side, they can cooperate to give more than 2 free die rolls in the battle. If a king is present, his strength bonus must be counted. Any princes can be counted at the owning player's discretion. If there is only princes present, they all have to count. Now, minuses are pluses for the other side, and these things cancel out, so only 1 player gets the extra dice. Which is to say, let's say I have a +2 leader and you have a -1 leader, well then I get 3 extra dice. If I have +2 and you have +1, I only get 1 extra die, whatever. Okay. If a king is present as the force, he counts, yeah. If a royal piece is present at a battle and that character's army takes casualties which wipe out their total strength, the royal character must suffer the consequences. He will be either captured or killed. You make a survival roll for the character, subtracting 1 from the die roll. If he doesn't die, if he dies, he's just dead. And no big deal. They might tear him apart or something, but it doesn't do anything. If he survives the roll, he may be captured. Once a character is captured, you can't kill them, though. A royal character can escape from battle at any time, even if he's the only surviving unit in an army after casualties are removed. Remember, the royal piece is a piece that takes casualties. So, a royal character can be retreated to any neighboring province in which there are only army counties from his own country or none at all. If a king or prince wishes to make good his escape before combat starts, he's not permitted to make use of his strength bonus. If his strength rating is taken into consideration in the pre-battle rolls, he's stuck fighting. At the start of a round of combat, either player can choose to retreat with his or her surviving army counters. The opposing player is allowed a free attack. The retreating forces may move into any neighboring provinces regardless of presence of other army counters. They cannot attack army counters in that province, but they may be attacked. Well, attacks happen at the end of your turn, so that doesn't really make sense. At the end of a round of combat, either player may offer surrender to the other side. Terms can be negotiated. The other players may be unable to agree. If the latter, the battle just continues. If the former, the surrendering player must comply with the surrender terms as they affect the pieces or counters in that army and the province in which the battle is fought. Any other arrangements can be conveniently forgotten. Now, what is not specified? Can I give you army units or something like that? None of that's in the game, but none of it's specified not in the game. And normally you would say, well, you just can't if it's not in there. But any other arrangements, if the former, what are the surrender terms? There's nothing about I could demobilize them, there's just nothing about anything. So there are basically no terms. There's nothing about, well, we can agree that I lose 2 units. It's just completely up in the air what's allowed in terms of negotiations at this point. Clearly, you could negotiate about, yes, I'll transfer you something, and that's a promise given late that'll be applied later and has no effect on anything, and it plays within the normal rules of the game. The question is, what are the rules that you can, agree to at the moment of battle, and basically I can't think of anything. You could say, I'll give you some money, I guess. Whatevers. We'll figure that out as we go. This is very Games Workshop-y. Captured royal characters. Royals can be captured in a number of ways. Yeah, surrender, what does it mean to surrender troops, right? I don't know. I'm assuming that you can't give somebody your units. Although there were certainly cases of mercenary units that changed sides, I am assuming that you can agree to destroy your units, to retreat some of them, to surrender some units, whatever, to surrender some of the stuff you're carrying. But it's really left so vague. Royal characters can be captured in a number of ways. If they survive their survival roll, they're captured by the victorious player's army and held for ransom. They can be immediately transported to the victorious player's capital. Well, what happens if they're not? The object would be to ransom the character some way that would be beneficial for the captor. You can demand money, trade items, a marriage contract, anything the other player can give within the limits of the rolls. As soon as the captor is satisfied, the character can be returned to the capital of his own home country, and it takes no time to do, and magical troops appear with that unit and whatever. No birth rolls can be made for children while they're in prison. You could pass over them for succession, which will cause penalties. Capitals count as the equivalent of 10 army counters. Only a defending player can count a capital as part of his force. Okay, the capital has to be wiped out entirely during the course of a battle. If you fail to do that, it goes back up to 10. So you might fight multiple rounds of combat, I think. seem to remember that there are multiple rounds of combat. Combats continue with multiple rounds. So yeah, you can do multiple rounds of combat to wipe out the capital, but if you give up fighting it, it will grow completely back, even though you're besieging it. Any resources are captured when they're defeated. There's never any money with forces, though. There's money in the capital. When you capture the capital, I think you get half the cash the player has. At various times in the game, players may go into formal and informal alliances. The formal ones require a marriage contract. All alliances that involve joint military ventures must be made in writing. Okay, this joint venture affects combat as follows. During the movement phase, that's not combat, whenever a member of an alliance moves before the other, they can omit to move some of their troops, and then the last alliance player is allowed to move all the troops covered by the treaty. Combat is conducted as agreed to in the treaty. As to who makes the die rolls and decisions, I guess. Who cares about die rolls? It's decisions, but they only talk about the fucking die rolls. How GW? Alliances can be broken at any time, unless covered by a marriage contract. A player may refuse to move his or her military units at any time when the alliance's battle plan calls them to be moved. Now, what's the relationship to between these two sentences? Not clear, right? Alliances can be broken at any time unless covered by a marriage contract, but am I allowed to refuse in addition to that, or is that an explanation of this? Again, very GW, you can't tell. If circumstances, okay. A player may refuse to move when the alliance's battle plan calls them to be moved if circumstances have changed in such a way that the previous plan is inadvisable, not impossible. There's no penalty for this beyond the possibility of upsetting your former alliance partners. It sounds to me like, and this would make sense if you consider Henry VIII and Charles V's marriage alliance, which required, or some kind of alliance, which required Charles to support attacks on France, and basically they could never coordinate. One or the other did something. Charles eventually won in France and then gave nothing to Henry, and it was just a mess. Was it Henry VIII? Must have been. Okay. Here's my favorite rule. There's no naval combat in the game. If a province is captured with enemy fleets, they must move away. Some players may be tempted to introduce naval combat into the game, but this has been purposefully omitted from the rules because naval combat was not a feature of the 14th century. Bullshit. I can find 4 or 5 major naval conflicts in the 14th century. And setting aside this objective, its introduction would push the game further towards wargaming. Later they discuss why this isn't a wargame, and it has, the addition of naval rules does not make this more or less a war game. It just doesn't. The naval conflict would be on par with what there is, one would assume. So it's like, again, It just irritates you so much to read this kind of shit, and it's so GW type thinking. It's just not coherent, and the rules don't tend to be. These aren't too bad, but I'll call them out when I see them. In order to prevent the game from getting bogged down in negotiation, these should be restricted to men on the spot. 2 armies have to confront one another, or a trading piece has to move to a province and then negotiate its passage. If no agreement is reached, the move is wasted. Well, that's a weird thing. So what do they mean the trading piece has to be moved to a province? I move it to here and ask, can I go through your territory? Or do I move it into your territory, it's now yours, and I ask, can I keep it? Again, not clear, whatever. If no agreement is reached, the move is wasted. Yeah, it's more than wasted. You just handed them the piece. Players should not indulge in radio communication between heads of state prior to making a move. Obviously, the above only applies to negotiations conducted outside the dynastic phase. My feeling is, outside of a fight, you pretty much are not going to be able to negotiate anything unless it's done somehow. And I mean, can two guys on the ground talk about the potential of moving something? And what does it mean? Is there any, cross-border discussion that's not negotiation? I don't know. I don't think there can be, but whatever. Okay, now here we come to an interesting rule that makes very little sense to me. A monarch can enlist foreign aid under any terms agreed. What? If this involves military assistance to put down rebellions, for example, the monarch's charisma score is reduced by 1. This can have the effect of reducing the monarch's charisma below -2. Okay, so what is foreign aid? And let's say I say, yes, you can come into my territory and attack my enemy. I guess I'm penalized there too, not just putting down rebellions, because that's just for example, not the only case, whereas the rest of it is outside of that. But someone could go do that without me asking. What's up with that? How do we determine that? Again, who knows? Foreign assistance can be agreed as part of a marriage contract, in which case the conditions are binding, or as part of a more informal agreement. The rules for alliances apply for the purpose of movement and combat when a monarch accepts foreign intervention. Well, what allowed us to do this? I don't know. Except that the player controlling the monarch should make all the moves in combat die rolls for the foreign troops. My feeling is there's some kind of concept here that I can loan you troops and maybe leaders and you move them. Until such a time as their owner chooses to take control of them, their owner could actually, through the course of some sort of deal, operate within your territory and just do these things. Does that change the nature of the foreign aid? Again, not explained. Inviting foreign troops onto your soil without guarantees of their behavior is a dangerous thing to do. Yeah. Well, so you get control of them, you definitely get the penalty. What's up if you don't have control of them, but they come in? Does it matter whether or not you actually asked for them, or if somebody just, intuited that you could use that foreign aid and invades you and doesn't take control of your territory? Yeah, my battery doesn't look like it's charging right. This brings me to an argument that I've heard made, which is that Europeans view that American rule sets, I heard this probably in the 90s or whatever, were too strict and structured, and Americans demanded that you nail down every rule completely. But honestly, I read these rules and I'm like, I could see that it's playable in the sense that, maybe I come up with some interpretation that works, but I have no clue what they actually intended. And maybe playing loosely, we come to a point where we look in the rules and are just like, what the fuck? And what do? You throw a die, you do a fist fight, what the hell? When it is just so obvious that they're just not covering shit, fairly important stuff. They're bringing this rule into play for little or no reason, as far as I can see, and then just not even giving a hint as to what it's supposed to mean and how it's supposed to work. I'm generally someone who's in favor of rules being kind of loosely stated, possibly leaving them open to some potential misinterpretation. The one game SPI made where they put in a rule, any rules disputes will be handled by a vote of, this is Canadian Civil War, of the players within the Parliament, using the parliamentary rules for that, to determine who gains it. Those rules have almost, and then they said we deliberately left things a little fuzzy for it. Those rules have almost nothing that can be left open to misinterpretation. These, however, man, they could definitely use something like that. And I could see something like that in Warrior Knights, where there is, again, a parliamentary system for determining, how, well, for generating laws and stuff where it would be a perfect thing, but no, they didn't fill that in there. And I'm pretty sure, I don't remember the Games Workshop rules for that. All I have is the Fantasy Flight Games ones, which are fine. It's actually a really tightly put together version of it. But I can only imagine the GW ones were as much of a mess as this, or worse, like Talisman's rules, which in some cases are just unplayable. I'm talking first edition here. I'm sure later editions got better. First and second edition. But man, they were just so bad. And it's like, there were plenty of game companies in the US that were putting out rule sets that maybe had a question or two in them, but they just did not almost have this systematic attempt to make something that did not make sense. I don't know if Games Workshop is the only case of a company that was like this. Again, what I heard was this argument that all American games were too rigid about their rules and European games were not, or something like that. And I always extended that to the EU and stuff like that, where I said, well, there's definitely interpretations open, but honestly there are in Empires and Arms too that are holes that are probably bigger than EU has to drive through. And no, that's probably not possible, but none of that comes close to what GW manages. GW feels like you've got a game kit in most cases. You really have to kind of make house rules to make the game even work in major portions of the game. Well, I am going to have to pause there because that thing wasn't charging, and now it is again, and this one's almost dead. Unfortunately, while I was letting I knew I was going to do this. While I was letting my batteries charge, I started a new video game. One I just bought today, so. Cashing in resource items. So, like I said, if you can get resources to your capital, you can cash them in at the end of any 5-year turn. And basically, if you have the 3 basic goods, you can turn it in for 50 crowns. If you also have a semi-luxury, you can get 80 crowns for it instead. And if you have all 5 types, you can get 120 crowns. This is the only way you can turn things in. And again, you probably have to deal and cut, plans to get resources allocated to people. So some people, like the English up here, have a couple of grain available to them, which is kind of cool, and a metal. Well, they need cloth. So they could very easily arrange something, maybe through a marriage deal, where they're trading grain for cloth. But if you look around, there's no one who has 2 cloth, right? And then they might end up trading grain. Let's say they're talking with Spain, grain for a cloth 1 year and a semi-luxury the next, and just exchanging in that sort of way. They might end up with excesses, though, of certain things. So now they're going to end up with excesses still of grain and metal, and it'll just kind of shake out however it does. But of course, if you can gain things militarily, then you don't have to worry about as much trade. Okay. The game supposedly ends at any agreed time. Now, it's 100 years on here, but again, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that 100 years is a reasonable amount of time in terms of the game isn't going to go too far. The families aren't going to get too big in that time. I'm worried that might not be enough to satiate me, but on the other hand, I'm also worried that the families will get too large if you play much more than 100 years, which is, of course, the opposite of what generally happens in this time period, but we'll talk about that later. So, they come up with rules for less than 5 players, which involve removing countries, which seems like the perfect answer to say, why is there an Italy and or a Spain in there? But the rules for that involve moving the resources so that actual players have them, or it's not really clear which, it's not really clear that this doesn't happen. The territories become kind of neutral areas that can be captured. Details of contracts could be kept secret, conceivably. You can conceal cash, which of course makes the money looking different or looking all the same helpful in that. Taxation should be simultaneous for whatever that matters. With armies and fleets, that is sequential, in the sense that if one player does something, everyone else gets to react. They give some advice about it. And now we go to the optional rules. And there's a whole series of these. One is a 4-character start, which gives you a couple of children at the beginning of the game. I don't remember if I think you start with one child at the beginning of the game at age 5. Here, it kickstarts the game to age 10 and 5. I'm not sure I want to do that, simply because I would rather the families differentiate more, and I would also rather give them time to grow into something interesting. Of course, if somebody dies right away, that could fuck the whole game up, which is something that has to do with initial characteristic rolls for the king and queen, where you randomize them at the beginning of the game. That improves the chances that someone will die early because they might get a crappy constitution. Okay, here's one of the most interesting to me, the disputed succession. You'd think that's really exciting. That's going to allow something more interesting. What it actually just does is changes the rules of who you can pass over. So it gives you the opportunity to pass over a legitimate heir who would otherwise be there, which maybe I would allow at some points. I don't know. It has special penalties in addition to the normal succession penalties. All characters in the dynasty will get a -1 penalty to their strength for as long as the legitimate heir or his or her heirs is still alive. And the dynasty controlling the rightful heir has a bonus, as they normally would. The new monarch also has a penalty on his charisma score, which is either -1 or -2, which could drop you as far as -3 or -4. But this is not inherited by the new monarch's heirs. And that's only if it's exceptional passing over. The player controlling the deposed character has to pass that character to the player to his left. Now, the weird thing is, what if somebody who is the legitimate heir is imprisoned and someone else is crowned? That's normally that legitimate heir comes back and joins the family, but is, I don't know, sort of the legitimate heir penalty kicking around for whatever reason. I don't know. I'll probably play with that simply because movement of trade items, this doesn't require you to move the trade items along the board. Basically, you announce where you're going to move them, and if no one objects, you can move them as stated. If someone does object, the owning player has to show the route, and then there's like this interception, and to me it looks like simply a more abstracted version of it, and I don't see much value to doing this. I would rather force players to actually move the goods at the rates the armies and goods move at. The event cards have a series of different things in them. And they have some special kinds of cards on them. So bidding and investing, for example. If you're bidding on cards, starting with the player who drew the card and going clockwise, counterclockwise for me probably, each player in turn is allowed to bid cash on them. If you succeed in winning the bid, you pay the cash and you get to decide whether or not the card takes place. Investing is similar, but it's basically sealed bids. So instead of an auction, you just do a set of sealed bids that are revealed immediately. Personally, I don't know why you would differentiate the two, but I can see reasons. We'll see how the cards are written, but I'm guessing it will be thematically sensible based on that. Inheritance of neutral provinces and kingdoms. There's a couple of cards that allow you to take control of basically the kingdoms that aren't in the game to begin with. Things like Wales and Poland and Denmark. These titles, once they're introduced, can be inherited in normal ways. If your dynasty already included the King of England, you could take advantage of a card and marry that heir to the King of Denmark, blah, blah, blah. Couple of the cards, 31 and 33, I don't know which two those are. You invest crowns to make the match, and the rules on investing should be followed. The other two, you have to invest resource items. However, it's probably explained on the cards. Titles to be inherited are for provinces normally part of another player's kingdom in 30 and 32, namely Spain. If the optional rules for governing provinces are being used, I'll be using those. The title being granted is a noble title, which puts them under the crown as basically a governor. 31 and 33, as well as creating character sheets for a prince. The successful player can also place a royal piece on the board in his or her capital, following normal rules. The prince can lead armies, govern provinces, etc. However, no children should be produced for the marriage. These are assumed to be part of that ruling dynasty. So I think what those two cards allow you, Denmark and Poland probably, is they allow you to incorporate a temporary alliance through marriage to one of those other kingdoms. We'll see how the card works. If neutrals are used, I'll be using them. You may fight a war against these. Also, the arrival of the free companies or other military events might draw them into a war with forces which are not under the control of another player. Whenever you have to fight against the neutral army counters are used. The player to the left will roll the dice. It doesn't seem like there's any decisions involved. They're just worried about rolling dice. Unless directed by event cards, neutral armies never leave the province from which they start. They always defend, never retreat, and never surrender. So no decisions. If they capture a royal character, they ransom for 100 crowns. Free companies, you roll a die, have the score. This is the number of free companies. We got event card War with the Welsh, War with the Swabians, War with the Burgundians, War with Aragon, War with the Moors. It's a number of neutral things that show up. At the end of the last movement phase of that turn, these counters are removed. If the neutral conquers a province, though, that province becomes neutral. And we have some flags for neutral. The Albigensian Crusade and the Crusade are neutral armies stated on the card. The Cathar rebels remain until the end of the last movement phase in the turn unless defeated. The Cathars will make Dauphine a neutral province. The Saracens should be removed at the end of the last movement phase of the turn. I'm assuming that's going to be a Spanish Crusade because there's no box or anything. Oh, no, there's a Holy Land box. I bet you there's a fight in the Holy Land. Okay. The weird thing is the Reconquista is, about half over at the end of the 13th century. So, yeah. Pretenders and Bastards. There's cards that allow characters to leave their dynasty and join another player's characters, and then they're passed to the character to the left. I might prefer seeing them randomly placed. That whole... this seems like a major gain to gain another character supported by you, or to have bidding or something like that. I don't know. Characters can only become pretenders if they're at least 15 years old, and if they are the only male, and if they are not the only male child of the monarch, a pretender's wife, though not husband, should be returned to his original dynasty. No, who should be returned to the original dynasty. And any children less than 15 should also be passed to the player on the left. The new owning player may use it as if it's a member of their own dynasty from then on, perhaps even marrying someone in their own dynasty without a marriage contract. For a bribe of 50 crowns, though, you can buy the pretender back. That looks like it can be done at any time, like maybe just before a battle or something even, I don't know. The pretender or any of his or her heirs may inherit the throne through normal means while still controlled by a foreign dynasty. The claim would be inherited exactly as any normal title. The player who has been controlling the disputed country up to that point may pass over the pretender's claim, using the disputed succession possibly, or they can become a baronial player. Now this is kind of fucked up. It's basically saying that if a pretender is installed, they remain part of the alliance that, was supporting them. I'm not sure how much I believe that. History doesn't generally follow that way, but on the other hand, it would be just a free pass to the person who lets the pretender take the throne otherwise. So I don't know how to go. I almost feel like another player should take over in that case. Because honestly, if you legitimately inherit a kingdom, even though you were supported by another country, you may feel some obligation. You may have some that's enforced by the game. But the idea of you would be under control of that player for the rest of the game as a second part of that dynasty or something, that seems a little funky to me. I don't know. A pretender or any of his heirs may inherit the throne. We talked about that. If a player controlling the pretender actually managed to conquer the whole of the disputed country by military means, he has the choice of either setting the pretender up as a separate monarch, still controlled by that dynasty. I assume that is the one that controls him, not the one he's born to. Or play it safe and rule the conquered area just like any other. I'm not really convinced I'm not convinced which one's safe. You wipe someone out, and I don't know. I mean, the idea of conquering someone seems like it's actually less violent than inheriting their territory in terms of the dispute roll, the rebellion rolls or something. We'll see how it works out again. 38 and 39 allow the creation of bastard sons of unmarried kings. Oh boy, this one doesn't make sense at all. These characters are passed to the player on the right. Again, I would rather randomize completely, who controls them from now on. Anytime that character lands in a province of his father's kingdom, there's an immediate rebellion roll. If a female character ever comes to the throne while the bastard lives, every province in the kingdom must be checked for rebellion. Makes sense with the female character thing. And it's a lot more iffy to say that some royal bastard would have the capability of causing that disruption. But if you think about, I don't know, like your Henry IV or something like that taking over, you could kind of see it, I guess. The dynasty is less... He's not really part of the dynasty, but again, we're not talking about a bastard in that case. Bastards' claims can never be inherited, although the character can marry and have children. Well, what the fuck? What if you become king? The player operating the character may control the character as he or she wishes, including marrying the character to a female in his own dynasty. So they can marry and have children. They can't pass their claim over. I would say if they somehow manage to establish a kingdom, it should be all good. But again, I don't feel like one kingdom would control another, even if it managed to put a crown. It might for the life of that king, but that's it. And that's what bugs me there. And again, the game would have to be a lot richer to handle all that kind of detail in a rigorous, rules-based fashion. And without a rigorous rules-based fashion, what am I playing? Some kind of little role-playing game here on a board. Okay. So neutral provinces, we'll be playing with these. Why? Because they indicate certain weaknesses in the kingdoms, etc. In some cases, maybe less than others. So England, it's Yorkshire and East Anglia. Do those make sense? Yorkshire certainly was less, yeah, that's all the York territories, was less aligned to the English crown at certain times. I don't know if it ever really qualified as neutral, but again, we're going to follow the rules. I feel like this creates a little bit of richness of story to the game and allows the kingdoms to expand without forcing the players into an immediate fight. France, it's Burgundy and France. Wait, what? We got France. I would say they probably mean Flanders there where they say France. That would make sense. These are a couple of... This is really part of the Burgundian kingdom here, which largely was not well controlled by the French king. On the other hand, if we're talking 1300, the English crown actually was fairly well consolidated at that point, if I recall correctly. The French one was not. France was a fairly weak power under the Capetians. Are we beyond the Capetians at this point? I don't know. They give some dynasty names, but again, they don't feel very well aligned to the time period. So France, okay, Anjou, yeah, right. Martel, there we're going back to the Franks. Bourbon, way too early. Guise, yeah, but no, certainly not for the royal family. The Angevins, again, that's basically the Anjou, and that is a family that ruled England, not France. And Nevers, again, a powerful... I believe it's the Capetians at this point, still. And again, they go way too far here. And not necessarily, you know, I mean, if you're at 1300 and you're not going to pick Plantagenet, what are you going to pick? Well, York and Lancaster are Plantagenets. If you're going to make fantasy stuff up, well, that's not one. Essex, you know, that's a duchy, that's not a family name. Percy is a family name, that's fair fantasy. Tudor, not so much at that point. But, you know, you might take the Marshall family or something, for all I know. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just like, what the hell? And when you look at how crazy the choices are for France and England to a large extent, the places where it's much more questionable, like Italy or Spain, you have a really hard time coming up with anything. You know... But again, it's not really historical, so I may just make up their names as like, it's the France dynasty, it's the England dynasty. I don't know what I'm going to do. I've got these thoughts of making whole genealogy charts. Shit. Battery's running low. This thing really sucks energy. The last of these videos of the type that I'm used to. I've got so many of these, and they just need it just needs some fixing to the wires inside, but I can't get them open well enough to basically reposition the wires. So I keep buying more cameras, and this one is a real power sucker, and it's got more complicated interface than any of the others, and gives me less valuable information about what I'm doing. Maybe it has additional features. It feels more like it's just a shittier version of the older cameras. I don't know if the quality is any better or not. It's got a light on it. Okay. So, I haven't put all these down. I'll put the rest of them down, I guess. Burgundy and France. Germany is Friesland and Swabia. Does that make sense? So Swabia, so there's something interesting going on with Swabia around this period, if I recall correctly. Basically, we're talking about prior imperial families which have kind of given way and are challenging the current emperor or something like that. The Holy Roman Empire is such a mess because it's electoral, and it means that the imperial family could actually move. It can tend to, although quite often there were two counter emperors for fair amounts of the time. So I mean, it's a fucked up situation. Italy, Piedmont, and Sicily. Well, what the hell is that supposed to represent? Given that Italy at this period starts out as... Oh, that's not the Sicily I'm used to. That's the other Sicily. Given that Italy was at least nominally imperial territory at this point, but there were significant issues. South Italy was largely Norman. That makes sense here. Piedmont is to represent Savoy or whatever, I guess. But the rest of it was largely, it could be considered kind of independent, but owing fealty to the empire. And to a large extent, you could say that about most of the large imperial territories. If Saxony wasn't the imperial home, it was a pretty powerful factor in things. It wasn't as neutral as it wasn't as independent from the empire as it would become, in the later days of the empire, say Maria Theresa's period in Austria or whatever. And finally, Spain is Aragon and Portugal, which makes it sound like Spain is Castile, really. Although clearly everything around here down should be not Christian and not part of Spain, whatever it is. But again, it's a fantasy world as far as I'm concerned. So these neutral provinces are considered to have a garrison of 2 neutral armies, which is pretty easy to wipe out, I would guess. If the province would have been part of the player's country in the basic game, it becomes home province after conquest. So these become a high priority to clean up for most of the players. And I think it makes the game a little bit, it ramps the game up in a sense that you have something to do other than cut deals without trying to jump into a major war. And I like the neutrals in diplomacy. I think it makes the game a little bit more powerful, or a little bit more interesting to begin with. So governing provinces, this is a twisted rule. So the way this works is anytime during the dynastic phase, or as directed by an event card, you may choose to bring a province into direct ownership of your dynastic house by making a prince the governor of the province. To do this, you announce which character will be given the title and which province the decision affects. The province must be one controlled by the player at that moment. Only a prince, at least 15, can be created a governor of the province. Also, female characters and children may inherit the title later, following normal rules for inheritance, as though, they follow their inheritance as though they're their own little kinglet at this point. All provinces not so governed are completely directly controlled by the king. But you give that prince a noble title, and they give options, and they should contain the name of the province, otherwise you'll get confused. The rules of succession do not apply in the following areas. The king of the relevant country may choose to dispute the normal succession. If this is only within the player's own dynasty, a rebellion marker should be placed in that province, but otherwise the king's wishes are followed. If it is some other player's dynasty, then not only does the rebellion show up there, but rebellion die rolls must be made with normal modifiers for the whole kingdom. The idea here being, if you're taking rights from another major family, you are, disrupting the whole realm, basically. Characters can govern multiple provinces. If a minor inherits a title, the regent will be the monarch, and he'll treat it as part of the kingdom for that point, during that period, during the minority. Titles and governorships affect the game in a number of ways. For characteristics, the player should immediately give the character a +1 bonus to his strength or guile characteristic. This may take a characteristic above +2. This bonus can only be taken once, no matter how many provinces they govern. Now, this is interesting, because it doesn't sound like it goes away. It may be possible for such a prince to then become king. And what you've done by making them a governor is you increase their military capability, or their guile, which is essentially the same, by 1 in order to affect things. Now, what does it mean that it could be above +3? That's a weird situation. Does that mean, or it could be above the normal +2 range into the +3 range? Do they get to apply that in combat? normally they wouldn't be able to apply that extra plus in combat if they got it through a marriage or something like that. So there's kind of a, yeah, I get the feeling it's intended to be included. And what that kind of represents is something like the Prince of Wales situation, where you give this to your primary heir because there's no harm then. Your primary heir is going to inherit the kingdom, and you need not worry about the fact that you made them a governor. You do have to worry if you make some other characters governors, because maybe that goes down into a female line and then it ends up married into some other family. Of course, you probably have some control over those marriages in a way that you don't have control in a way that isn't really historically accurate. You know, if a duke were, for the most part, like a duke's daughters were his own to dispose of, and if he married them off to the King of France, the King of England might have a problem with that, but he might not be able to prevent it. He probably would be able to, but it might cause a revolt. It might cause the duke to essentially take up arms. It's something that you're not supposed to be able to do within normal feudal positions, depending on the country, I'm sure. Taxes in a governed province. So, the noble has a capability to raise taxes instead of the king. The king sets his rate of tax for the whole country, but the province, governed by the character directly, raises 2 extra crowns, which at the enhanced version goes from 7 to 9. The provincial governor from a foreign dynasty would keep those 2 extra crowns. They can also refuse to pay the base money that the king is levying and just keep that themselves too. The king might not like this. Also, whenever the provincial lord is actually present in that province, now the weird thing is, if somebody else controls it, you're effectively at war with them anyway, so you could just invade them, which is, you know, yes, you can't just negate their succession, but you can march in and take their territory. And I'm not sure really that the holding off of some taxes is going to make much difference in that decision. It certainly would help increase it, though, the chances. Also, whenever the provincial lord is actually present in the province, the taxes raised from there should be modified by their charisma. Okay, I don't know what that means. I'm guessing that you add their charisma to the tax value. This is not something that's done normally. It does modify the rebellion chances. Commanding troops in a governed province. The same rules for maintaining and raising armies remain on the same as the basic game. However, the governor of a province is the commander of any armies located in that province, so long as the governor is a prince aged 15 or more, is present with the army counters, and so long as the king is not, the governor controls the armies there. This might mean that the army is under the control of a foreign prince. This makes it difficult, you know, if something is divided up among other players, it makes it difficult to control your army, because the provincial governor in command of such an army may either obey the instructions of their monarch, in which case the movement turn will proceed as normal, or not. The provincial governor who does not have complete control over these troops. Well, what does that mean, however? And may only command them while they remain in the province. If they move further than this, the army counters revert to the control of the king. Yeah, what's not absolutely clear there is, can you hold those troops hostage? It seems like you can, but again, wow, not nicely spelled out, I would say. Okay. Raising trade items in a governed province. In a resource area province, the governor can raise more than one trade item during the interphase, or can hinder the trade to such an extent that trade items are lost. This can occur if the governor is present in the province, a die is thrown during the raised trade items, and the governor's charisma is added to it. If the result is 7 or more, the province produces an additional trade item, which should be placed there immediately. If the result is 0 or less, the normal production in the province is affected, and the normal trade item doesn't get placed. I don't know how much these have been tested. Again, it seems like you would want to make a prince who creates extra trade items for you. And if it's your royal prince, that's a pretty good idea. Events in governed province, a governor is presumed to live in the province. They will be affected by plague and famine. If plague occurs in that province, the governor, his or her wife, and her husband, and any children 15 or younger make survival rolls. Now, this is weird. The governor is presumed to live there some or all of the 5-year term. This is not the case with the capital. The king, the princes, they are only affected by whichever province they're actually in. But this seems to be that the governor is in 2 places at once for the effect of these negative, the plague negative effect. If a rebellion occurs, the governor's charisma will count as a modifier in the province in which he or she is located. Not governing. It should also be used as a modifier in the governed province, as should that of the governor's spouse. Yeah, okay. There's an option to add an extra event movement phase. I like this one. I like the idea of more turns in between each dynastic period. I may change my mind on that, but that's one that I am planning on using along with the governing. The governing provinces feels like it has a lot of loose ends, though, to deal with. Changing initial capitals and resource areas. This is basically a board scramble rule. You're able to place things in different places, and there's a set of rules for them. It's just really to create a different kind of board, you know. But I feel like these are more historically accurate to some extent. Venice certainly is the place where the luxuries of the East were mostly coming into. Genoa did too. It doesn't produce anything, you know. Again, there's not a lot of detail on the trade side of this. Lords of the Renaissance deals with trade in a more detailed sort of fashion. And still has the gain all the money that you can. It also differentiates between like the chancellor and the royal household, and I could easily see a game of that played with like 12 dynasties on it, which I think is actually optimal. 6 players is I think the natural breakdown, and if you had 12 different dynasties, you would assure that each person has one of the 12 major offices in the game, and that could create some really interesting stuff. Neither game adequately handles the religion. Well, Lords of the Renaissance has the Pope as one of the dynasties, which I don't really like. I feel like the papal powers should be somehow purchasable by dynastic interests in that case. But I want to play around with this. I've never gotten a chance to play it solo, and the one time that I played it opposed, I don't think we got too far into it. We basically worked our way through the rules, played a few turns, and if my memory is correct, the owner of the game essentially said, "I hate this game." And we played a little more and then pretty much gave up at that point. And probably hated it for some really dumb reason, in my opinion, because it usually was. Okay, I'm going to send this one up and probably go back to my video game. Maybe start this tomorrow.